I never thought that a simple box with a DNA test would shatter my life, and at the same time become the beginning of my revenge. My name is Sarah. I grew up in what I always believed was a loving family. My parents, my sister, they were my foundation, my safe haven. I trusted them implicitly. They had always been there for me, supporting me in everything I did. Never in my life did I have a reason to question their sincerity or loyalty. My childhood was filled with warmth. We had family dinners where we shared our daily experiences, we celebrated every holiday together, and I genuinely believed that no matter what happened, we were a unit. Unbreakable, inseparable. I remember summer vacations at the lake house where my dad would teach me how to fish while my mom prepared a picnic on the shore. I remember Christmas mornings, the smell of cinnamon filling the air as we unwrapped gifts by the fire. My sister and I had our fair share of sibling rivalries, but in the end, we always had each other's backs. Everything was normal. That is, until one seemingly insignificant event set off a chain reaction that would change everything. It started with a simple suggestion from a friend. We had been discussing those ancestry DNA kits, how they could tell you about your heritage, track long-lost relatives, and even uncover unknown family secrets. It was meant to be a fun experiment, something to do just for the sake of curiosity. I didn't hesitate. Why would I? I had nothing to hide. No deep-rooted secrets in my family that I was aware of. So I ordered the kit, swabbed my cheek, and sent it off. I didn't think about it again until weeks later when an email notification popped up on my phone. My results were ready. I opened the report, scrolling through the genetic breakdown of my ancestry with mild interest. It was fascinating to see my origins mapped out. Percentages of different ethnic backgrounds, potential distant relatives, and health predispositions. I smiled at the thought of sharing this with my parents at dinner. But as I moved further down the page, my eyes froze on the section labeled Close Family Matches. My father's name was not there. A strange, sinking feeling settled in my stomach. There had to be some mistake. DNA tests weren't infallible, right? Maybe there was an error in the system, a glitch in the database. I refreshed the page, checked again. No match. My father, the man who had raised me, who had been present for every milestone in my life, was not my biological father. I stared at the screen, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe I had entered my details wrong? Maybe he had never taken a test himself, and that's why he wasn't showing up? But no. Deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't a mistake. A sudden coldness swept over me. My hands trembled as I closed my laptop, my breath coming in short gasps. If my father wasn't my real father, then who was? I sat there, gripping the edge of the table, trying to process what this meant. My mother knew. She had to. And if she knew, had she lied to me all these years? Had my father known too? I thought back to small moments that suddenly took on new meaning. Times when my mother had avoided certain topics. Moments when my father had seemed distant for no reason I could understand. The realization made my stomach churn. I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over my mother's contact. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. What would I even say? I took a deep breath and dialed the number. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Sarah, sweetheart, how are you?" Her voice was warm, familiar. For a moment, I almost lost my nerve. But then I looked at my laptop screen again, at the glaring truth staring back at me. "Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." There was a brief silence. Then, carefully, she responded, "Of course, honey. What's wrong?" I hesitated only for a second. I took a DNA test. Silence. A long, heavy silence that stretched between us, confirming what I already feared. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Oh, Sarah." That was all it took for my world to crumble. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. "So it's true, isn't it?" Another silence, then a slow, reluctant exhale. "We need to talk." A chill ran down my spine. Whatever she was about to tell me, I knew it would change everything. At first, I convinced myself it had to be a mistake. The DNA test must have been inaccurate, mixed up with someone else's. Or maybe my father had never taken one, and that's why he didn't appear in the system. But deep down, I knew the truth. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. I went straight to my mother, my hands shaking as I held up my phone, the DNA results still glaring at me from the screen. "Mom, there's something wrong with this. My test says Dad isn't my father. That's not possible, right?" Her face went pale in an instant, her usual warm and reassuring expression flickering into something cold, guarded. She waved a hand dismissively, trying to brush it off. "Oh, those tests aren't always accurate, sweetheart. You know how these companies are. They make mistakes all the time." But the way she said it, too quickly, too nervously, my mother, who had always been so composed, so steady, was unraveling in front of me. "Mom," I said, my voice firmer now, my heart hammering in my chest. "Tell me the truth." She wouldn't look at me. Her fingers twitched against the edge of the kitchen counter. "Sarah, please don't make a big deal out of this. It doesn't change anything." That's when I knew. I didn't need her to say the words aloud. The truth was already there, hanging heavy between us. My mother, the woman I had trusted more than anyone, had been lying to me my entire life. I turned and walked away before she could say anything else. If she wouldn't tell me the truth, maybe my father— no, the man I had called my father would. I found him in his study, pretending to read the newspaper like he always did in the evenings. "Dad," I said, standing in the doorway, "I need to ask you something." He lowered the paper slightly, his eyes meeting mine for only a second before he looked away, already knowing what I was about to say. "Sarah, Just tell me." I cut him off, my voice trembling. "Is it true? Are you not my real father?" He sighed, setting the newspaper down on the desk. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time in my life, he looked small, defeated. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I wanted to tell you. But your mother, she didn't want you to know." The world tilted around me. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "Who is he?" I demanded. "Who is my real father?" My mother had followed me into the room now, her voice rising in panic. "Sarah, please. It doesn't matter. Your father, he raised you, he loves you. That's all that should matter." But it did matter. It mattered more than anything. After a long silence, she finally said the words that would change everything. "His name is Richard Calloway." The name meant nothing to me. At least, not at first. But as soon as I searched for him online, I felt my stomach drop. Richard Calloway wasn't just some ordinary man. He was a millionaire, a powerful businessman with a net worth in the hundreds of millions. And my family had known all along. The truth hit me like a freight train. They hadn't kept this from me out of love or protection. They had kept it from me because it benefited them. My mother, my so-called father, even my sister. They had all played a part in keeping me from discovering the truth about my real father. My sister had always been given special treatment, extra financial help, expensive gifts, opportunities I never had. And now I understood why. My family had been hoarding resources, ensuring that I never suspected there was another source of wealth that rightfully should have been mine. I confronted my mother again, my voice shaking with rage. "You knew he was rich, didn't you? You knew, and you kept it from me." She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. Instead, she whispered, "We were protecting you." I laughed bitterly. Number you were protecting yourselves. I left the house that night with nothing but my car keys and my phone. My entire life had been built on lies, and now, standing in the wreckage of it all, I had only one thought in my mind. They had stolen my identity, my inheritance, my truth. And I was going to make them pay. The moment I stepped out of my family's house that night, I knew there was no turning back. The weight of their betrayal settled deep in my chest, fueling the storm that had been brewing inside me. I wasn't just angry, I was determined. They had stolen the truth from me, manipulated my life for their own benefit, and now it was time to take control. The first step was to find him, Richard Calloway, my biological father, the man who had been kept from me my entire life. I spent the next few weeks gathering every piece of information I could. I scoured online records, found articles about him, and even managed to get access to legal documents that proved his paternity. Every detail only deepened my resentment toward my so-called family. Richard Calloway wasn't just some ordinary businessman. He was one of the wealthiest men in the city, an influential figure whose name carried weight in the corporate world. The more I learned, the clearer it became. My mother and the man I had called my father had worked hard to keep me in the dark. But I wasn't going to stay in the dark anymore. While I was investigating my biological father, I carefully distanced myself from my family. I stopped answering my mother's calls, ignored my sister's texts, and avoided any interaction that would give them an idea of what I was planning. I needed them to believe I was still lost in my emotions, not actively plotting my next move. In the meantime, I consulted with lawyers. If my father was as wealthy as the record suggested, then there had to be something I was legally entitled to. It didn't take long for my suspicions to be confirmed. There were documents that proved he had set up financial support, but my mother had intercepted it, keeping me from ever knowing. That was the final straw. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to dismantle their entire web of lies. Finally, after weeks of preparation, I reached out to Richard Calloway. The phone call was brief. His assistant was skeptical at first, but when I sent over proof, documents that linked us biologically, everything changed. Within hours, I had a direct call from him. His voice was hesitant, laced with emotions I wasn't sure how to interpret. "Sarah," he said, as if testing the name. "Is it really you?" A lump formed in my throat. For all my planning and preparation, I wasn't ready for the way that simple question made me feel. "Yes," I answered. "It's me." The silence stretched between us before he finally spoke again. "I've been looking for you." His words shattered something inside me. My whole life I had believed that I was unwanted, that my real father had abandoned me. But that wasn't true. It had never been true. We met in person the next day. Seeing him for the first time was surreal. He looked at me like he was trying to memorize every feature, like he had missed out on something irreplaceable. And in that moment, I realized he had. "I never stopped searching," he admitted. "But your mother, she made sure I could never find you." The anger I had been holding on to twisted into something else. Sadness, loss, years that had been stolen from us. But there was still time to make things right. With his help, I finalized my legal case against my mother and the man who had raised me under false pretenses. The money they had stolen from me, the lies they had built their lives on. It was all coming to light. Then I made sure the world knew the truth. I used social media to tell my story. I exposed the lies, the deception, the way they had manipulated me for years. My sister, the golden child who had always received special treatment, watched as her perfect world crumbled around her. My mother, once so confident in her control, could do nothing as everything she had built on deceit collapsed. And as for the man who had pretended to be my father, he lost everything too. His reputation, his stability, gone, just like the life he had stolen from me. By the time it was over, they were left with nothing. Meanwhile, I had everything I had ever been denied. A father who truly wanted me, a future that was finally mine to control, and most importantly, freedom. For the first time in my life, I was truly free, and that was the sweetest revenge of all. The moment my biological father, Richard Calloway, publicly acknowledged me as his daughter, everything changed. My family, no, the people who had lied to me all my life, were thrown into complete chaos. I had spent weeks carefully unraveling their web of deceit, and now, the final blow was about to land. My online expose had already sent shockwaves through our social circles. Friends, relatives, and even strangers flooded my messages with disbelief and sympathy. But it was nothing compared to the reaction from the people who had betrayed me. My mother called me dozens of times, leaving frantic voicemails filled with half-hearted apologies and desperate pleas. My father, the man who had raised me under false pretenses, was furious. He threatened legal action, tried to claim that I was manipulating the truth. But the DNA results didn't lie. The financial records proving they had stolen from me didn't lie either. As for my sister, Emily, the golden child, she was spiraling. She had always lived in comfort, secure in the knowledge that our parents would support her no matter what. But now, with Richard stepping in and rewriting his will to include me, and only me, her world was crumbling. I had expected her to lash out, to fight. Instead, she called me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" I almost laughed. "Why? Because I deserve the truth, Emily. And I deserve justice." She was silent for a long time before finally saying, "You're destroying us." "No," I corrected. "I'm just revealing what was already broken." As if on cue, the legal team Richard had hired went to work. He had resources beyond anything my former family could have imagined, and he was determined to right the wrongs that had been done to me. He filed lawsuits against my mother and her husband, exposing the financial theft and manipulation they had engaged in for years. They had intercepted money meant for me, siphoning it into their own luxurious lifestyles while leaving me unaware of my true origins. The scandal became public. News outlets picked up the story, calling it a shocking tale of deceit and betrayal among the wealthy elite. My mother, once the perfect hostess and respected socialite, found herself being shunned by the very people she had once considered friends. My so-called father, who had built his career on an image of integrity, saw his business deals fall apart as partners distanced themselves from him. And Emily, poor, privileged Emily, found that without financial support, she was utterly unprepared for the real world. I wish I could say I felt guilt. That, in watching their downfall, I experienced even a flicker of regret. But I didn't. They had spent years deceiving me, molding me into someone who fit into their perfect little narrative. And now, I was rewriting that narrative in a way they could never have expected. The court case was brutal. The judge wasted no time in cutting through my mother's lies, and when confronted with undeniable evidence, she had no choice but to admit what she had done. I sat there, watching as the weight of her actions finally sank in. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Not just fear of losing money or status, but fear of losing everything she had worked so hard to protect. Emily, sitting in the courtroom, refused to meet my gaze. Perhaps she finally understood that she had spent her whole life benefiting from my suffering. Or perhaps she still blamed me for everything falling apart. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. When the verdict came down, it was swift and unforgiving. My mother and her husband were found guilty of fraud, financial misconduct, and obstruction of parental rights. They lost everything. The mansion I had grown up in was seized to cover their legal debts. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their influence, once so strong, was now meaningless. And then came the final blow. Richard Calloway, my true father, officially amended his will. Not only did he name me as his sole heir, but he publicly declared that he was severing all ties with my mother. She would never see a cent of his fortune, nor would Emily. The people who had stolen from me, who had manipulated and controlled me, were left with nothing. As I walked out of the courthouse, the weight that had pressed on my shoulders for so long finally lifted. The air felt crisper, the world brighter. For the first time in my life, I was free. Free from their lies, free from their control. Richard walked beside me, his presence a comforting reassurance that I was no longer alone. He looked down at me, his expression filled with something I had never seen from the man I had once called my father. Genuine love and pride. "I'm sorry for everything you've been through," he said softly. "But I promise, from now on, you'll never have to fight alone." I smiled, a real, unguarded smile. I know. Revenge had never been my goal, but justice? Justice had been served, and now I could finally start living the life I was meant to have. The past no longer held power over me. I had spent too many nights tormented by betrayal, by the weight of lies that had shaped my life. But now, standing on the threshold of my new beginning, I finally understood. I was free. Leaving behind the toxic ties that once bound me was the hardest decision I had ever made. For years, I had clung to the illusion that family was sacred, that love was unconditional. But love should not be a prison. It should not demand silence in the face of deception. And it certainly should not be wielded as a weapon to control and manipulate. With my real father's guidance, I started rebuilding my life piece by piece. He was patient, kind, so different from the man who had raised me. He helped me see that strength was not in enduring pain for the sake of appearances, but in walking away from it. He taught me that loyalty should never be blind. I pursued the education I had once been denied. Knowledge became my refuge, my weapon against ignorance and submission. With each course I completed, with each book I devoured, I felt the shackles of my past loosening. I was no longer the girl who begged for love from those who never truly cared. I was becoming the woman I was meant to be. Still, the scars of betrayal did not fade easily. There were nights when I dreamed of my childhood, of a time before I knew the truth. I saw the faces of those who had deceived me, and for a moment I wished I could go back to that ignorance. But the past was a mirage, a beautiful lie that had already crumbled. And I refused to build my future upon the ruins of falsehood. I found solace in people who truly valued me. Friends who stood by me not because of obligation, but because they saw me for who I was. Flawed, determined, and real. They taught me that family is not always defined by blood, but by trust, by unwavering support, by love that does not demand sacrifice in return. One day, I stood outside the house where I had once lived, the place that had been both a home and a prison. I felt nothing. No longing, no regret. Only a quiet understanding that I had outgrown it, just as I had outgrown the pain they had inflicted upon me. I did not need closure from those who had wronged me. Their silence was its own answer. And I no longer sought justice in their apologies. The greatest revenge was my freedom, my happiness, my refusal to be broken. Richard, my real father, encouraged me to explore life beyond the boundaries I had known. He introduced me to people who had overcome adversity, individuals who had been betrayed yet refused to let it define them. Their stories became my inspiration. If they could rise from the ashes, so could I. I took up writing, pouring my experiences onto paper. My words resonated with others who had suffered betrayal, abandonment, and heartbreak. Letters from strangers flooded my inbox. People who had endured similar wounds, thanking me for giving them hope. It was then that I realized my pain had not been in vain. I had found a purpose in my suffering, a way to turn my past into something meaningful. There were days when doubt crept in. I wondered if I had been too harsh, if my actions had been justified. But then I remembered the years of lies, the stolen opportunities, the countless nights spent feeling like I was never enough. And I knew I had done what was necessary. Some wounds should not be ignored. Some betrayals should not be forgiven. Months turned into years, and with each passing day, I became stronger. I traveled, I learned, I surrounded myself with people who uplifted me. My bond with Richard deepened, and for the first time in my life, I knew what it felt like to be truly loved. Not out of duty, not out of control, but out of choice. One evening, as I watched the sunset from the balcony of my new home, I reflected on how far I had come. The pain of the past no longer consumed me. It had shaped me, yes, but it no longer defined me. A message from Emily appeared on my phone. For a moment, I hesitated. Then curiosity got the better of me. Her words were short, almost hesitant. "Do you ever regret it?" I stared at the screen for a long time before finally typing my response. "No, I did what I had to do. She didn't reply, and I knew she never would. That chapter of my life was closed. As I set my phone down, I felt a sense of peace I had never known before. I had lost a family, yes, but in losing them, I had gained something far greater. I had gained myself. And as I whispered the final truth of my journey, I knew with absolute certainty that it was worth it. I lost a family, but I found the truth and freedom, and it was worth it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more unbelievable real-life stories.